The orange light of dusk streamed through the cracks of the shack when Maria looked up and saw what would change her life forever. Her hands still clutched dry twigs, her fingers rough from knowing the weight of labor since before she learned to dream. In the makeshift stroller, her daughter Brooke slept with the kind of peace only very young children possess, oblivious to the world around them, protected by a sacred innocence. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The river flowed gently at that hour, reflecting a sky that seemed to bleed at the edges. Maria was 23, but she carried on her shoulders the weight of a woman who had lived many lives. A single mom, no family nearby, living in a house that felt more like a temporary shelter that had become permanent. She worked washing clothes for the families on the other side of town, the ones who lived in houses with manicured lawns and automatic gates. She always returned at dusk, her arms aching, her back bent, but with enough to buy milk for Brooke and maybe, on good days, a piece of meat for their beans. That Thursday afternoon, she had decided to gather firewood before darkness enveloped everything. Winter was approaching, and the nights were growing colder and colder. The kerosene lamp consumed too much fuel, and the wood-burning stove was her only reliable source of warmth. She walked along the riverbank, where twisted trees offered an abundance of dry branches, pushing Brooke's stroller over the uneven ground. It was then that her eyes caught something that didn't belong in that landscape. A human form, motionless, almost melded with the damp earth of the bank. For an instant Maria thought it was a dead animal or a pile of abandoned rags. But there was something in the configuration of that shape, a curvature only human bodies possess, a fragility that screamed in silence. She stopped, her heart pounded without permission. She looked at Brooke, still sleeping, then back at the fallen figure. Reason told her to keep going. She already had too many problems. She already carried too much weight. But Maria's feet didn't obey reason. They never did when her heart spoke. Louder, she approached slowly, the twigs forgotten on the ground, the stroller parked a few feet away. It was a woman, very old. The skin on her face looked like a map of deep wrinkles, each line telling a story Maria would never fully know. Her eyes were closed, her mouth slightly open, her breathing so faint she had to lean in to perceive it. A faded shawl, which might once have been red, partially covered her shrunken body. Maria knelt beside the stranger. She touched her face with the delicacy of someone touching something sacred and fragile. The skin was cool, but not icy. There was still life there, however faint. The old woman opened her eyes for a second. Cloudy, lost eyes that seemed to see nothing and everything at once. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then they closed again. What to do? The question echoed in Maria's mind like a bell. There was no hospital nearby, no phone, no one. Just her sleeping daughter, and that woman the world seemed to have forgotten by the side of a river that kept flowing. Indifferent to it all, Maria looked around. Twilight was advancing quickly, shadows stretching like hungry fingers. Soon, darkness would be complete. Leaving the old woman there meant condemning her to death, perhaps to the night's cold, perhaps to animals, perhaps just to the absolute solitude of someone who dies unnoticed. She didn't think much, or perhaps she thought too much in seconds that felt like hours. The fact was that her arms, previously too tired for any extra effort, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She carefully lifted the old woman from the ground, feeling each fragile bone beneath the thin skin, each pound that seemed to weigh far more than it should. The stranger's body was light as a bird's, but the weight of that decision was immense. Maria settled the old woman in her arms, adjusted Brooke in the stroller with one hand, and began the long walk back home. The path had never seemed so endless. Each step was a sacrifice, each yard a trial. Sweat trickled down her forehead despite the cold, and her muscles silently protested. But she kept going, because there was something about that abandoned woman that reminded her of her own grandmother long since passed, because there was something about that situation that made her soul cry out that this was what had to be done. Maria's house was a wooden shack with a corrugated metal roof, built on a vacant lot on the furthest outskirts of town. It had one room that served as everything: bedroom, living room, kitchen, a makeshift bathroom in the back with a pit toilet she had dug herself. There was no luxury, but there was dignity in the way she kept everything clean and organized. There was love in the small details: the calico curtain on the window, the vase with dried flowers on the rough table, Brooke's tiny clothes neatly folded. By the time she arrived, night had completely fallen. The kerosene lamp was lit with trembling hands. Maria laid the old woman on her own bed, the only mattress in the house, and began to assess the situation. The woman was dehydrated, that was clear. There were injuries on her feet, blisters indicating a long walk. Her clothes, besides being old, were dirty and torn in several places. Brooke woke with the movement and began to cry. Maria divided her attention between calming her daughter and caring for the stranger. She heated water on the stove, prepared a weak herbal tea with the herbs she kept for emergencies. She cleaned the old woman's wounds with clean cloths, applied an aloe vera paste she grew in the yard. She changed her clothes for an old nightgown she no longer wore. Throughout this time, the old woman remained in a state of semi-consciousness. Sometimes she would open her eyes and murmur disconnected words. Sometimes she seemed to smile, a vague smile that could be gratitude or delirium. Maria didn't know for sure, but she kept caring for her because it was the only thing she could do. When the old woman finally fell into a deeper sleep, Maria sat on the floor with Brooke in her lap and let exhaustion take over her body. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The night silence was broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the soft breathing of the three women in that small space. "What have I done?" Maria thought. The question wasn't one of regret, but of astonishment at her own capacity to act without calculating consequences. She could barely support herself and her daughter. How was she going? To care for an elderly stranger? Where would she get food, medicine, time? Logic said she had made a mistake, but something deeper, something that came from a place beyond words, told her she had done the only possible thing. Brooke fell asleep in her arms, her little mouth slightly open, her long lashes casting delicate shadows on her round face. Maria kissed her forehead and laid her in the small makeshift crib in the corner of the room. Then she spread a blanket on the floor, beside the bed where the old woman slept, and lay there, her eyes fixed on the tin roof that creaked with the wind. She didn't sleep for long. The thoughts were too much, the worries too heavy. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion won, and she sank into a dreamless sleep, her body finally yielding to what her mind still resisted. When the first ray of sunlight pierced through the window crack, Maria woke with the feeling that her life would never be the same. And she was right. The old woman watched her with eyes that were now lucid. There was something in that gaze, a depth that contrasted with the body's fragility. Her lips moved, and this time words came out, weak, hoarse, but understandable. "Why did you bring me here?" Maria sat up, rubbing her eyes, trying to organize her thoughts. The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. "Because you were alone," she finally said, "and no one deserves to die alone." The old woman remained silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Maria as if trying to decipher something written in her soul. Then a tear trickled down her wrinkled face, lost among the folds of her skin. "My name is Zelda," the old woman said, and I was ready to die." Maria didn't answer. She simply held the old woman's hand in hers, feeling the thin bones beneath the skin mottled by time. Outside, the day was beginning, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding in that small shack. Brooke woke up and began to babble, demanding attention. Life continued, with its relentless demands, its urgencies that wouldn't wait. But something had changed. An invisible current had been cast between those three lives, a thread that bound them in a way none of them yet understood. Fate, whimsical as ever, had placed an abandoned elder in the path of a young mother who already had too many problems, and both, unknowingly, were about to discover that sometimes the greatest burdens carry within them the greatest treasures. The morning advanced slowly, carrying with it the weight of decisions that needed to be made and the mystery of that woman who had appeared out of nowhere, bringing with her 93 years of stories Maria couldn't even imagine existed. The days that followed were a silent battle against the impossible. Maria woke before dawn, brewed thin coffee with the little sugar she had, left, nursed Brooke, checked on Zelda, and left for work with her heart torn into pieces. She left the old woman alone. There was no other option. She placed water within her reach, dry biscuits, a bucket for urgent needs, and she prayed, all the way to her clients' homes, that nothing bad would happen in her absence. Zelda, little by little, began to regain her strength. It wasn't a spectacular recovery, the kind you see in movies. It was slow, arduous, marked by setbacks. Some days she could sit up in bed and eat by herself. Others she could barely open her eyes, lost in fevers that came and went without explanation. Maria learned to live with uncertainty, to make the pre-dawn hours her only time for care, to stretch every penny until it screamed for mercy. The first week was the hardest. Maria discovered that it wasn't enough to just feed and clean. Zelda needed medicines Maria couldn't afford, doctor's appointments that didn't exist for people like them, and constant care that her job didn't allow her to provide. She did what she could. She gathered wild herbs, prepared teas according to recipes she remembered from her grandmother, improvised compresses and poultices with what nature offered freely. And it worked, in some mysterious way. Or perhaps Zelda simply wanted to live, now that there was someone who cared whether she lived or died. It was on a rainy night, about 10 days after the rescue, that the old woman finally told her story. Brooke slept in her crib. The rain drummed on the tin roof, and the kerosene lamp cast trembling shadows on the walls. Maria had just finished changing Zelda's foot dressings, wounds that were finally beginning to heal, when the old woman took her hand and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her stop. "You need to know," Zelda said, her voice firmer than it had been since her arrival. "You need to know who I am, and why I was by that river." Maria nodded silently, sitting on the edge of the bed, her ears attentive. "I had a family," the old woman began, and there was something in the way she pronounced the word that suggested invisible quotation marks. "A son. His name is Randy. Or was, I don't know anymore. For me, he ceased to exist the day he left, me on that bank." The rain intensified outside, as if the sky wanted to punctuate the narrative with its own sadness. Zelda continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. "Randy was always a difficult man. From childhood he was calculating, self-serving. His father died young and I raised him alone, washing clothes, cooking for others, doing a little of everything. When he grew up, went to college, got a good job, I thought things would get better. I thought he would take care of me like I took care of him. How naive of me." Maria felt a tightening in her chest. She knew stories like this, stories of children who forgot, of parents who were discarded like objects no longer useful. "At first, it was even good," Zelda continued. Randy got married, had kids, and I went to live with them. I helped around the house, took care of the children, did everything I could to be useful. But the years passed and I got older, slower, sicker. And his wife, Sharon, started complaining. She said I was too much trouble, that I took up too much space, that I cost too much. Money. The old woman's voice faltered, and Maria saw that her eyes gleamed with suppressed tears. But Zelda didn't cry. She seemed to have exhausted all possible tears long before that night. Randy gave in to his wife's pressure. First, they moved me to a smaller room, then to an annex in the back of the house. Then they started talking about a nursing home. I begged them, Maria. I begged them not to send me there. I said I'd rather die than go to a place like that. And do you know what my son did? Maria shook her head, though she knew the answer would come anyway. He put me in the car, said we were going for a drive, and left me by that river. He just stopped the car, helped me out, said he was going to get something from the trunk, and drove away. He drove away, Maria. He left me there as if I were an old dog, no longer good for anything. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Maria felt a rage build in her chest, an indignation that burned like embers. But she also felt a deep sadness, the kind that has no bottom, that seems to swallow everything around it. I stayed there waiting, Zelda continued. At first I thought it was a mistake, that he would come back. Then, when it got dark, I understood. I understood that my own son had abandoned me to die. And you know what? I accepted it. I lay there on the cold earth and accepted it. I thought that was how it was supposed to end, that it was what I deserved for raising a son like that. You didn't deserve any of that, Maria said, her voice choked. Nobody deserves that. Zelda smiled, a sad smile that seemed to contain all the wisdom and all the pain in the world. You found me, child. And you brought me here, even without knowing me, even without having anything. Why did you do it? Maria thought for a moment before answering. The rain continued to fall, a sound that filled the silence without breaking it. Because I saw my grandmother, she finally said. When I looked at you lying there, I saw my grandmother, who died alone in a public hospital because no one had time to stay with her. I saw my mother, who abandoned me when I was 5, and who might one day be somewhere needing help. I saw myself, many years from now, God willing, old and tired, hoping someone would have compassion. The two women looked at each other in silence, and in that gaze there was a recognition that transcended words. Two lives so different, separated by decades, united by a riverbank, and by a decision made at dusk. From that night on, something changed between them. Zelda ceased to be just a stranger Maria had rescued. She became something more, something neither of them yet knew how to name. Companion perhaps, confidant, or simply someone with whom to share the weight of the days. But if things were improving inside the shack, outside they were starting to get worse. The neighborhood noticed the old woman's presence, and it wasn't long before comments began. Maria heard them as she walked through the narrow alleys of the neighborhood, fragments of conversations that died down as she approached, glances that spoke louder than words. "She's lost her mind," said Mrs. Lois, the neighbor from across the way, to anyone who would listen. "It wasn't enough to have a little daughter. Now she's brought a strange old woman to care for. Have you ever heard of such a thing?" "It really is crazy," agreed Mr. Anthony, who lived 2 houses down. "That girl has no sense. She'll end up starving to death, her and the child." The whispers multiplied like weeds, spreading through the neighborhood with the speed of a wildfire. Maria tried to ignore them, but it was difficult, especially when the comments began to affect her work. One of her clients, Mrs. Evelyn, called her aside one day and asked, with that tone of false concern the wealthy use when they want to meddle in the lives of the poor, if it was true that she had taken in a homeless woman from the street. "She's not a homeless person," Maria replied, trying to stay calm. "She's an elderly woman who was abandoned, and I'm taking care of her." Mrs. Evelyn wrinkled her nose as if detecting an unpleasant odor. "Well, I think it's very imprudent," she said. "What if this woman is dangerous? What if she has diseases? You have a small daughter, Maria. You need to think about her first." Maria didn't respond. She swallowed the words that wanted to come out, picked up the bundle of dirty clothes, and went to the wash basin, her hands trembling with suppressed anger. She knew arguing would lead nowhere. She knew that, in the eyes of the world, she was just the laundress, the one who was supposed to silently accept others' opinions about her own life. Weeks passed, and Maria's financial situation reached a critical point. Feeding 3 mouths with what barely fed 2 before was an impossible equation. She started skipping meals, eating only once a day so Brooke and Zelda could eat twice. She lost weight, her dark circles deepened, but she kept going because there was no other option. Zelda noticed. Of course she noticed. The old woman's eyes, now lucid and attentive, saw everything. She saw Maria refuse food, saying she wasn't hungry. She saw her clothes becoming looser on her thin body. She saw the exhaustion that even sleep couldn't cure. "You're wearing yourself out because of me," Zelda said one night when Maria returned from work more exhausted than ever. "You need to let me go, take me to a shelter, a hospital, anywhere. I can't be the cause of your ruin." Maria sat beside the old woman, taking her hands in hers. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But even as she said these words, Maria didn't know how. The pantry was almost empty. The month's money was already gone, and she still had 2 weeks until her next paycheck. The kerosene for the lamp was running out. The cooking gas, too. It seemed the universe was conspiring to prove that her compassion had been a mistake, that the neighbors were right, that she had embarked on an impossible mission. It was that same night, as Maria fought against sleep and despair, that Zelda began to speak of her past. Not the recent past, of the family that abandoned her, but the distant past, when she was young and the world still seemed full of possibilities. "I was a weaver," the old woman said, her eyes lit by a light Maria hadn't seen before. "One of the best in the region. My tapestries were sold at major craft fairs, bought by wealthy people. I knew secrets few others did. Secrets of colors, of threads, of patterns that told entire stories." Maria listened, fascinated. She had never thought of Zelda as having been anything other than an abandoned old woman. But there she was, speaking of a lifetime of art and work, of hands that once created beauty. "I still remember everything," Zelda continued. "Every knot, every stitch, every dye mixture. It's all in here." And she tapped her own head lightly. "My body might have failed, but my memory still holds everything." Maria didn't know yet, but in that seemingly casual conversation, the seed of a transformation was being planted, a seed that would take time to germinate, but that, one day, would change everything. Winter hit hard that year. Mornings dawned covered in frost, and the biting wind cut through the cracks of the shack, as if the walls didn't exist. Maria woke with numb fingers, her body curled under blankets too thin for the cold. Zelda coughed during the nights, a dry cough that echoed in the silence and kept them all from sleeping. Brooke cried more, perhaps sensing the tension that permeated the air, intuiting as a baby that something was wrong. The situation had become untenable. Maria knew it, even if she refused to admit it. Aloud, her work income no longer covered even basic necessities. She had sold everything she could, the old radio that was her only companion on lonely nights, the pots and pans she didn't use often, even some dresses she saved for special occasions that never came. Everything was converted into food, medicine, kerosene. And even then it wasn't enough. The neighbors, instead of helping, seemed to feed on her misfortune. Maria saw them whisper as she passed, saw the malicious smiles, the looks of those watching a show and waiting for the tragic outcome. No one offered help. No one extended a hand. It was as if her decision to take in Zelda had turned her into a pariah, someone who had violated unwritten rules about who deserves help and who should be left to die. The visit from the social worker came on a Tuesday afternoon, without warning. Maria had just put Brooke to sleep and was preparing tea for Zelda when she heard a knock on the door. The sound was authoritative, impatient, very different from the timid knocks of the rare neighbors who still spoke to her. The man was tall, thin, with a narrow mustache that gave him an air of studied seriousness. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt and carried a clipboard full of papers. His eyes scanned the interior of the shack with professional swiftness, cataloguing every detail, every piece of evidence of poverty, every reason for concern. "I'm from Child Protective Services," he announced without preamble. "We've received complaints about this residence. May I come in?" It wasn't really a question. He was already stepping inside before Maria could respond, his shoes treading on the packed dirt floor, as if it were enemy territory to be conquered. Maria felt her blood run cold. Complaints. She knew exactly who had made them. She could picture Mrs. Lois's face, her neighbor, satisfied at finally finding a way to harm her. The man asked questions, many questions, about her income, about her working conditions, about why there was an unknown elderly woman in her house, about whether she was capable of adequately caring for a child. Each question was a disguised accusation. Each answer seemed insufficient. Maria felt she was being judged, and that the verdict had already been decided even before the interrogation began. Zelda remained silent throughout the visit, her eyes fixed on the man with an expression Maria couldn't decipher. Brooke, awakened by the noise, cried in her mother's lap, her baby cries adding tension to an already unbearable situation. "You are aware," the man said at the end, tucking his clipboard under his arm, "that if a situation of risk for the child is found, we will be obliged to take action." Maria felt her legs weaken. Action. The word sounded like a death sentence. Taking Brooke from her. That's what he was threatening. Taking her daughter because she had dared to help an abandoned old woman. "There's no situation of risk," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "My daughter is well cared for, well fed, loved." The man looked around once more, and Maria saw the judgment in his eyes. She saw how he perceived that space, not as a home, but as a scene of destitution, not as the fruit of her hard work, but as proof of her failure. "We'll return in a month for a new assessment," he said before leaving. "I recommend you resolve the situation by then." The door closed behind him, and Maria collapsed. She cried as she hadn't cried in years, tears that came from such a deep place they seemed to bring with them pieces of her soul. Brooke cried along, without understanding why, but feeling her mother's pain as if it were her own. And Zelda, from the bed, watched in silence, her trembling hands clutching the sheet. "I'm to blame," the old woman said when Maria finally managed to calm down. "If I weren't here, none of this would be happening." Maria wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and tried to find within herself the strength that seemed to have vanished. "You're not to blame for anything," she replied. "The blame lies with those who make false accusations, with those who don't care about others, with those who think they can decide how the poor should live." But even as she said this, a doubt began to form in her mind. What if the neighbors were right? What if her compassion was truly a form of recklessness? What if, by trying to save Zelda, she was condemning Brooke to an even worse future? This doubt haunted her in the following days, like a shadow. Every glance from Brooke was a reminder of her responsibility. Every cough from Zelda was an additional weight on her shoulders. Every sleepless night was another crack in her determination. Maria began to question everything, Her choices, her motivations, her ability to continue. It was on one of those sleepless nights that something unexpected happened. Maria was lying on the floor, staring at the ceiling, when she heard Zelda's voice, low but clear in the pre-dawn silence. "Do you know why my tapestries were so special?" Maria turned to look at the old woman, whose face was just an outline in the darkness. "Why?" "Because I used dyes no one else knew. Ancient recipes, passed from mother to daughter for generations. Colors that didn't fade, that glowed even after years. Blues that seemed to have stolen the sky. Reds that resembled fresh blood. Greens as deep as untouched forests." Maria listened in silence, without understanding where the conversation was leading. "These recipes are in here," Zelda continued, touching her own head. "No one else knows them. When I die, they die with me. Unless—" "Unless what?" Zelda paused for a long moment, and when she spoke again, there was a new energy in her voice. "Unless I teach them to someone, unless my hands, even trembling, can guide other hands. Do you have a loom?" Maria almost laughed at the question. A loom. She barely had food. "No, Zelda, I don't have a loom." "But it can be made," the old woman said. "A simple wooden loom. Mr. Anthony, the neighbor, isn't he a carpenter?" Maria remembered Mr. Anthony, one of those who spoke ill of her the most behind her back. The idea of asking him for something was almost absurd. "He wouldn't help me," she said. "No one here helps me." "People help when they see an advantage," Zelda replied, with a practical wisdom that contrasted with her apparent fragility. "You need to show them there's something to gain." That conversation planted an idea in Maria's mind. A crazy, improbable idea, but one that refused to disappear. In the following days, while working at her clients' homes, she thought, while caring for Brooke and Zelda, she planned. And little by little, like someone assembling a puzzle without having the complete picture, she began to see a possibility. It was risky. It would demand more effort than she had to give. It could fail spectacularly and prove everyone right about her folly. But it was also the only hope she saw on the horizon, a thread of light amidst the darkness that threatened to swallow her. Maria decided she would try. She had nothing left to lose after all, and sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, that's when you find the courage to risk everything. The first thing she did was talk to Zelda about the dye recipes. The old woman explained, with surprising clarity for someone her age, the necessary ingredients: barks from specific trees, flowers from certain plants, minerals that could be found in particular areas. Many of these elements existed in the region itself, growing wild, ignored by everyone. Maria began collecting them on her walks to work, storing them in cloth bags she hid in the shack. The second thing was to gather courage to talk to Mr. Anthony. She chose a Sunday, when the carpenter usually stayed home, and went to his door. He received her with suspicion, his eyes narrowed, his mouth ready for a refusal. "I need a favor," Maria said before he could say anything, "but it's not for free. I'll pay, just—" "Not with money?" Mr. Anthony crossed his arms but didn't close the door. "And with what, then?" "The elderly woman staying with me, Zelda, she knows how to make tapestries. Tapestries that are worth a lot of money in the big cities. If you build a loom for us, I'll give you a share of what we sell." The carpenter laughed, a dry, disbelieving sound. "You're dreaming, child. Who's going to want to buy tapestries made by you two?" Maria wasn't discouraged. She had anticipated that reaction. "If I prove I'm right, will you agree?" Mr. Anthony studied her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of pity and curiosity, that Maria chose to ignore. "If you prove it," he finally said, "I'll make the loom, but don't count on it." It was all Maria needed. A chance. A single chance to turn the impossible into possible. She returned home with a lighter heart than she had had in weeks, and when she told Zelda about the conversation, she saw a smile form on the old woman's wrinkled lips. "You have the determination of a weaver," Zelda said. "That's already half the battle." Nights became classrooms. While Brooke slept and the world outside surrendered to silence, Maria sat beside Zelda's bed and learned. She learned about yarns and weaves, about tension and balance, about the invisible math that transformed loose threads into fabric. She learned about colors, about how to extract them from plants and minerals, about the setting secrets that made the difference between a lasting dye and one that vanished in the first wash. Zelda taught with infinite patience. Her hands, though too tremulous to execute the movements, guided Maria's hands as if they were her own. Every knot was explained, every stitch demonstrated in the air, every technique transmitted with the precision of someone who had dedicated a lifetime to that art. And Maria absorbed everything like a thirsty sponge, memorizing every detail, practicing every gesture until it became automatic. "The secret is in the rhythm," Zelda often said. "Weaving is no different from breathing. When you find the right rhythm, the work flows on its own." Maria didn't understand this completely. Not yet. Her first attempts, made with improvised threads and a crude frame loom, were disastrous. The stitches were uneven. The tension varied from one end to the other. The result looked more like a poorly made fishing net than anything that could be called a tapestry. But she didn't give up. She unraveled and rewove, erred and corrected night after night, until her fingers began to understand what her mind still struggled to learn. Meanwhile, she continued working during the day, washing clothes at her clients' homes, earning the minimum necessary to sustain the 3 lives. Her dark circles deepened, her shoulders hunched even more, but there was something new in her eyes, a flame of purpose that hadn't existed before. Maria was no longer just surviving. She was building something. Collecting the ingredients for the dyes became an obsessive quest. Every path between her home and work was an opportunity to find what she needed. Zelda had described elderberry barks for purple, goldenrod flowers for yellow, marigold petals for orange-red, indigo leaves for blue. Maria found them growing wild on the edges of vacant lots, in abandoned backyards, on the banks of the same river where she had rescued the old woman. She brought everything home, dried it in the sun when possible, stored it in old cans she had salvaged from the trash. The process of preparing the dyes was complex and time-consuming. Each color required a different method, a specific proportion of water, an exact boiling time. Zelda guided everything from her bed, her voice firm despite her weak body, her eyes attentive to every detail. Maria followed the instructions to the letter, and little by little the liquids began to reveal their true colors. A blue as deep as the winter sky, a red as vibrant as fresh blood, a golden yellow like autumn sun. "It's working," Maria said, almost disbelieving, as she saw the first skein of yarn emerge from the dye bath with that impossible blue color. Zelda smiled, and there was pride in that smile. "I told you you had the hands of a weaver." Building the loom was the next challenge. Mr. Anthony, true to his word, had agreed to build it if Maria proved she knew what she was doing. She brought him a small fabric sample she had managed to produce, an irregular piece of interwoven colored threads that was more promise than accomplishment. The carpenter examined the work with the eyes of someone who understood wood and construction, not textile art. "It's nothing special," he said, tossing the fabric back to Maria. "Not yet," she replied, refusing to be discouraged. "But it will be. With the right loom, it will be." Something in her voice, perhaps her unshakable conviction or pure stubbornness, made Mr. Anthony reconsider. He scratched his chin, looked up at the sky as if consulting some higher power, and finally sighed. "All right, I'll make the loom. But if it doesn't amount to anything, you owe me a month's work." It was an enormous risk. A month of free labor would mean a month without income, a month of even more severe hunger. But Maria accepted without hesitation. She'd reached a point where risking everything was the only option left. Mr. Anthony worked for 2 weeks. He used salvaged lumber he had stored, old nails he straightened with a hammer, techniques learned over decades of improvised carpentry. The result wasn't pretty, but it was functional. A dark wooden loom with crude pedals and a frame that creaked with every movement, but which allowed the basics, warping and weaving. When the loom was installed in the corner of the shack, occupying precious space Maria had to create by pushing furniture around, Zelda asked to be taken to it. Maria carried her body light as ever, and sat her in a chair before the wooden structure. The old woman extended her trembling hands, touched the threads already arranged on the warp, and closed her eyes for a long moment. "It's been so long," she murmured, "so long since I felt this." "Now you," Zelda said, moving away with difficulty. "Sit here and show me what you've learned." Maria sat before the loom with a racing heart. It was different from the improvised frame she had used to practice. It was larger, more complex, more real. She touched the pedals with her feet, felt the resistance of the chords, looked at the stretched warp like a field of possibilities. "Breathe," Zelda said. "Find the rhythm." Maria breathed and began to weave. The first movements were clumsy. The threads tangled more than once. The beater struck too hard or too soft. But little by little, almost without realizing it, she found the flow. Her feet pressing the pedals, her hands guiding the shuttle, the rhythmic sound of the beater compressing the weft. It was almost hypnotic, that repetitive movement, and Maria finally understood what Zelda meant about weaving being like breathing. She worked until the first rays of sun entered through the window, until Brooke woke asking for attention, until her body begged for rest. When she finally stopped and looked at what she had created, she saw a small rectangle of fabric, imperfect but recognizable. The colors she had prepared with so much effort glowed under the morning light, vibrant and deep as Zelda had promised. "It's not perfect," Maria said, exhausted but strangely energized. "Nothing is perfect the first time," Zelda replied, "but this is real. This is a beginning." The following weeks were a brutal routine. Maria worked during the day at her clients' homes, returned at dusk to care for Brooke and Zelda, and wove through the night until sleep overcame her. Her fingers developed calluses in the right places. Her shoulders learned to bear the bent position. Her eyes grew accustomed to working in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. Zelda guided every step. She taught the traditional patterns she had learned from her own mother, geometric designs that told stories, stylized figures that represented elements of nature. Maria reproduced them with increasing fidelity, each tapestry better than the last, each piece closer to the ideal Zelda carried in her memory. The first complete work took 3 weeks to finish. It was a small tapestry, the size of a tablecloth, with a pattern of stylized birds in shades of blue and gold. Maria took it off the loom with reverent hands, stretched it before the window to see the colors under natural light, and felt a pride she had never experienced before. "It's beautiful," she said. Her voice choked. Zelda, who had followed the entire process from her bed, smiled with tears in her eyes. "It's more than beautiful," she said. "It's you. Every thread you wove carries a piece of who you are. That's what makes art true." The question now was selling, and that was a part of the plan Maria hadn't yet solved. Where to find buyers for handmade tapestries? Who, in that world of poverty that surrounded her, would have money to pay for something that wasn't strictly necessary? The answer came from an unexpected place. One of Maria's clients, Mrs. Carroll, was a different kind of woman, less arrogant, more curious, with a genuine interest in the lives of those who worked for her. On one of her weekly visits to pick up her freshly laundered clothes, Mrs. Carroll noticed Maria's hands, stained with dye, and asked what had happened. Maria hesitated. She wasn't used to sharing her life with her clients. But something in Mrs. Carroll's expression, an openness she rarely saw in people of that class, encouraged her to speak. "I'm learning to weave," she simply said. "An elderly woman who lives with me is teaching me." Mrs. Carroll raised her eyebrows, genuinely interested. "Weave? What kind of weaving?" And so, almost without realizing it, Maria found herself telling the story. She spoke of Zelda, of the rescue by the river, of the ancestral knowledge of the dyes, of the loom Mr. Anthony had built. Mrs. Carroll listened in silence, her eyes widening more and more. "I need to see this," she said when Maria finished. "May I come to your house?" The question took Maria by surprise. A client wanting to visit her shack? It was unimaginable. But she agreed, because she had no reason to refuse, and because something told her that visit could change everything. Mrs. Carroll arrived on a Saturday afternoon, driving her own car, a rare sight for a woman of her position at that time. Maria waited for her at the door of the shack, more nervous than she had been in years, her hands sweating despite the cold. She had spent the entire morning cleaning every corner of the house, organizing her few belongings, trying to make the misery seem less miserable. The client stepped out of her car and looked around with an expression Maria couldn't decipher. It wasn't disgust or pity, as she had feared. It was something more like curiosity. Perhaps respect for that woman who lived in conditions so different from her own, and yet maintained her dignity. "So this is it," Mrs. Carroll said, walking toward the door. "It's simple," Maria replied, feeling the need to apologize. "But it's clean." Mrs. Carroll waved her hand, dismissing the concern. "Simplicity isn't a flaw, Maria. Show me this loom you mentioned." They entered the shack together. Brooke slept in her crib, and Zelda was sitting on the bed, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. When she saw the visitor, the old woman straightened as much as she could, adopting a posture that recalled times when she wasn't just an abandoned elder. "Zelda," Maria introduced. "This is Mrs. Carroll, one of my clients." Mrs. Carroll approached the bed and extended her hand to the old woman. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, with a sincerity that surprised them all. "Maria told me about you, about your tapestry work." Zelda squeezed the offered hand, studying the visitor with eyes that had learned to assess people over 93 years of life. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. "It's rare to find people like you who are interested in what the poor do." It was a sentence that could sound like a critique, but Zelda said it with a smile that softened any harshness. Mrs. Carroll seemed to understand and accept the comment gracefully. "May I see the tapestries?" she asked. Maria went to the corner where she kept her creations, carefully folded and protected in clean cloths. There were 3 complete pieces so far, the first with birds in blue and gold, the second a geometric pattern in earth tones, and the third the most elaborate, depicting a sunset over a river with colors that seemed to glow on their own. Mrs. Carroll picked up each one with her hands, feeling the texture of the threads, observing the details of the work. Her silence stretched on, and Maria felt her heart tighten. What if she didn't like them? What if all this was just an illusion of value that only existed in her own hopes? "Where did you learn these colors?" Mrs. Carroll finally asked, her eyes still fixed on the sunset tapestry. "From Zelda," Maria replied. "They're natural dyes, made with plants and minerals, ancient recipes from her family." Mrs. Carroll looked at the old woman with an expression of astonishment. "This is extraordinary," she said. "I've never seen colors like these. They look alive." Zelda smiled, pride evident in every wrinkle on her face. "These are recipes that came from my great-grandmother. She was an enslaved person. She worked on a plantation where they made fabrics for the masters. She learned the secrets and passed them to her daughter, who passed them to my mother, who passed them to me. I thought they would die with me, until this girl appeared." The story hung in the air for a moment, laden with historical weight none of those present had anticipated. Mrs. Carroll looked from Zelda to Maria and back to the tapestries, as if seeing everything in a new light. "Do you know how much this is worth?" she asked, her voice low, almost reverent. Maria shook her head. She had no idea. "A lot," Mrs. Carroll said. "Artisan work like this, with traditional techniques and natural dyes, is extremely rare nowadays. In big cities, at fine craft fairs, in home decor markets, pieces like these sell for prices you can't even imagine." Maria felt her legs weaken. She leaned against the wall, trying to process what she was hearing. "I have contacts," Mrs. Carroll continued. "I know people who work with crafts, who organize fairs, who export to other countries. If you'll allow me, I can help take this work to the right place." It was an offer too generous to be true. Maria looked at Zelda, seeking confirmation that she wasn't dreaming. The old woman nodded, her eyes shining. "Why would you do that?" Maria asked, the natural distrust of someone who had suffered too much manifesting. "What do you gain from it?" Mrs. Carroll wasn't offended by the question. She even seemed to appreciate it. "I gain the satisfaction of seeing talent recognized," she said. "And I also gain the certainty that I'm doing something useful with the privileges life has given me. Not everyone with money is indifferent to the suffering of others, Maria. Some of us want to help, but we don't know how. You're giving me that opportunity." The words were sincere. Maria could feel that. And even if a part of her still doubted, the larger part, the one that had rescued an unknown old woman from a river and brought her home, decided to believe. In the following weeks, Maria's life changed in ways she had never imagined. Mrs. Carroll kept her promise. She took the tapestries to a major craft fair in the capital city, where they were exhibited alongside works by renowned artists. The interest was immediate and overwhelming. All 3 pieces sold on the first day for amounts that made Maria's monthly salary seem like pocket change. Orders began to pour in. People wanted more of those tapestries with impossible colors. They wanted larger pieces. They wanted exclusivity. Maria worked day and night, her fingers flying over the loom, her mind focused on every pattern. Zelda guided each new creation, suggesting color combinations, adjusting designs, transmitting knowledge that seemed inexhaustible. Money started coming in, first in modest amounts, enough to buy decent food and medicine for Zelda, then in larger sums, which allowed for small improvements to the house. A new roof tile here, a window that closed properly there, a real bed for Zelda instead of the worn-out mattress. The neighborhood watched, astonished. The same people who had mocked Maria now looked at her with a mix of envy and reluctant respect. Mrs. Lois, who had filed the complaint with Child Protective Services, tried to approach with flimsy excuses, but Maria kept her distance. She forgave, because holding a grudge was too heavy a burden to carry, but she didn't forget. Mr. Anthony, the carpenter, was the first to openly admit his mistake. He knocked on Maria's door on a Sunday morning, his hat in his hand, his expression embarrassed. "I came to apologize," he said bluntly. "I doubted you. I spoke ill of you behind your back, and you proved me wrong." Maria received him with the smile of someone who had long overcome old grievances. "You helped me when I needed it," she said. "You built the loom. Without that, none of this would have happened." Mr. Anthony nodded, still looking ashamed. "And what about what I said, that you owed me a month's work if it didn't work out?" Maria laughed. "Forget about it. We're even." The carpenter left feeling lighter, And Maria went back inside with the feeling that something had healed, not just in her life, but in the surrounding community. People were beginning to see that helping others wasn't a sign of weakness or folly, but could be the beginning of something greater. The visit from the social worker, a month after the first, was completely different. He arrived with the same authoritarian posture, but his eyes found a transformed scene. The house was tidy, there was food in the pantry, Brooke was playing with new toys, Zelda was sitting in a comfortable chair, smiling. "It seems things have improved," the man said, consulting his clipboard. "They've improved a lot," Maria confirmed, without arrogance, simply stating a fact. He asked his routine questions, checked the conditions, and in the end, closed his clipboard with a sigh. "I see no further reason for follow-up," he said. "The complaint has been dismissed." Maria didn't celebrate in front of him. She waited for him to leave, closed the door, and only then let the tears flow. Tears of relief, of victory, of gratitude for all the moments when she almost gave up but didn't. Zelda called her closer, taking her hand with trembling fingers. "You won, child," the old woman said. "You beat them all." Maria shook her head. "We won," she corrected. "Without you, I'd be nothing. And without you, I'd be dead by the side of a river. I guess we're even." The two laughed together, a laugh that echoed through the shack like music, chasing away the last ghosts of fear and doubt that might still inhabit that space. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. On the horizon, a cloud was forming, a threat neither of them had foreseen. Zelda's family, the one that had abandoned her, was about to reappear, bringing with them a storm of greed and resentment that would test everything they had built. The black car pulled up in front of the shack on a Tuesday morning, bringing with it the scent of expensive cologne and the arrogance of someone who had never had to worry about money. Randy, Zelda's son, stepped out first, smoothing his suit as if that gesture could protect him from the surrounding poverty. Sharon, his wife, followed close behind, her lips pursed in an expression of permanent disgust. Maria saw them from the window before they even knocked. There was something in the way they moved, in the way they looked at the neighborhood with contempt, that made her unconsciously clench her fists. She knew who they were. Zelda had described her son so many times that it was as if Maria already knew him. And everything she saw confirmed her worst impressions. The knock on the door was authoritative, without courtesy. "I know. My mother is here," Randy said when Maria opened the door, without even introducing himself. "I've come to take her home." Maria blocked the entrance with her body, her eyes fixed on the man's. "Zelda is resting, and she's not going anywhere." Randy laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Who do you think you are to decide that? She's my mother. I have legal rights." "Rights," Maria repeated, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. "You abandoned her to die by the side of a river. You left her like she was trash. Now you come talking about rights." Sharon stepped forward, her voice sharp and cutting. "Those are lies," she told. "My mother-in-law was always a confused old woman. She made up stories. We put her in a safe place, but she ran away. It wasn't abandonment." Maria almost laughed at the absurdity of that version. But before she could reply, Zelda's voice came from inside the house, weak but determined. "Let them in, Maria. I want to see my son." Maria hesitated, looking back. Zelda was standing, leaning against the wall, a surprising strength in her posture despite her fragile body. There was something in her eyes, a resolve Maria had never seen before. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "I am. I need to tell him a few things. Things that should have been said a long time ago." Maria stepped aside, allowing Randy and Sharon to enter. The couple looked around with the same contempt they had shown outside, evaluating every detail of the shack as if cataloguing proof of inferiority. So, this is where you were, Randy said, approaching his mother, living in a hovel with a stranger. Do you know how bad that made us look when people found out? Zelda didn't reply. Immediately, she looked at her son for a long moment, and Maria could see decades of history in that gaze. Love and disappointment, hope and disillusionment, all mixed in an expression that spoke louder than words. "You came to get me," the old woman finally said. "But it wasn't to take me home, was it? You came because you heard about the money." Randy had the decency to look embarrassed for a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "We heard you're involved in some kind of business," he admitted, "tapestries or something, and as your family, we're entitled to a share. You're elderly. You're not in a condition to manage finances." Maria felt her blood boil. It was even worse than she had imagined. Not content with abandoning their mother, now they wanted to profit from the work she could barely do. "You have no right to anything," she said, her voice trembling with contained anger. "Zelda is under my care, and the money she earns is hers." Sharon let out a disdainful laugh. "Under your care? What are you, a nurse, a professional caregiver? As far as we know, you're just a laundress who found a confused old woman and saw an opportunity." The words cut like knives, but Maria didn't back down. "I'm someone who did what you should have done. I cared for her when no one else would, and now you show up wanting to reap what you didn't sow." "Enough!" Zelda said, her voice surprisingly strong. Everyone fell silent, looking at the old woman. She had sat in the chair by the loom, her hands resting on the worn wood. "Randy," she continued, "I carried you for 9 months. I nursed you for 2 years. I worked like a mule so you could go to school, so you could have a better life. And what did you do with all of that?" Randy opened his mouth to reply, but Zelda raised her hand, silencing him. "You treated me like a nuisance. First you hid me from your important friends. Then you stuffed me into a small room in the back. And when that wasn't enough, you left me to die like an animal. Do you think I didn't know what you were doing that day? Do you think I was too confused to understand?" Tears began to stream down her wrinkled face, but Zelda's voice remained firm. "I knew exactly what you were doing, and I stayed there waiting because a part of me wanted to believe you'd come back, that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but you didn't come back. And when it got dark, I understood that my own son had condemned me to death." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Randy seemed to have lost the ability to speak, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. Sharon tried to intervene, but a look from Zelda silenced her. "And now you come here, to this house that isn't yours, wanting what? Money. I have no regret left for you, my son. You killed that inside me that night by the river." Zelda paused, took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost sad. "But I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying hatred is too heavy a burden for someone who has already carried so much in life. So I forgive you. But I don't want to see you again. I don't want your money. I don't want your guilt. I don't want anything from you. The only thing I ask is that you leave and let me live in peace." Randy remained motionless for a long moment. Maria could see a battle happening behind his eyes, emotions he had probably buried years ago trying to emerge. But in the end, the armor he had built around himself prevailed. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his suit, and once again assumed the expression of superiority he had brought with him. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice cold. "I'm going to file a lawsuit. I'll prove you're not fit to make decisions. That laundress won't end up with anything." Zelda smiled, a smile that contained all the wisdom of her 93 years. "Do what you want, Randy. But know that I already have everything I need. I have a roof over my head, food, and people who care about me. Can you, with all your money, say the same? Randy didn't respond. He took his wife by the arm and left, slamming the door hard enough to make the shack tremble. The sound of the car driving away was almost a relief, a collective exhale of accumulated tension. Maria rushed to Zelda, concerned about the effort the confrontation had demanded. The old woman was trembling, tears still streaming, but there was peace on her face. "I had to do this," she said, before Maria could ask. "I needed to say these things while I still had the strength. Now I'm free." Maria hugged her carefully, feeling the fragile bones beneath her arms. "He talked about a lawsuit," she said, worried. "Could it cause problems?" Zelda shook her head. "Let him try. I have the truth on my side, and I have you." In the days that followed, Randy's threat hung like a dark cloud. Maria consulted Mrs. Carroll, who in turn consulted a well-known lawyer. The answer was reassuring. Randy had no legal basis for his threats. Zelda was lucid, had chosen where she wanted to live, and there was no law that could force her to share her earnings with a son who had abandoned her. The lawsuit never materialized. Perhaps Randy had realized he had no chance. Perhaps the shame of having his story exposed in court was too much. Perhaps, in some hidden corner of his soul, a spark of humanity still remained that prevented him from causing his own mother more pain. Maria never knew the true reason and decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that Zelda was safe, free, and finally at peace. The old woman lived for many more months after that confrontation. They were good months, full of work and purpose. She continued to guide Maria in the art of weaving, transmitting more and more of her knowledge, as if she wanted to completely empty her reservoir of wisdom before it was too late. And Maria absorbed everything, grateful for every moment, aware that that time was precious and finite. The workshop they had created in the small shack gradually expanded. An adjoining room was built, then another. Young women from the neighborhood began to appear, curious about the work that had transformed Maria's life. Some just wanted to watch, others wanted to learn. Maria welcomed them all, teaching what Zelda had taught her, passing on the legacy she had received. The neighborhood, which had once mocked and criticized, was now proud. The small workshop became a landmark, an example that it was possible to overcome poverty with creativity and hard work. Mr. Anthony built more looms, this time with new wood and careful finishing. Mrs. Lois, swallowing her pride, came to ask to learn too, and Maria accepted her without resentment, because holding on to grudges was too heavy a burden for someone who wanted to fly. Brooke grew up among threads and colors exactly as Zelda had wished. At 5, she could already identify each dye by its scent. At 7, she made her first simple fabric, an irregular square that Maria kept as her most precious possession. At 10, she sat before the loom with the same determination her mother had shown years before, and truly began to learn. The transformation wasn't just for the family. The entire community had changed. The neighborhood that was once synonymous with poverty and despair was now known for the workshop, for its craftsmanship, for the women's weaving cooperative Maria had founded. Families that once went hungry now had stable incomes. Children who seemed doomed to repeat the cycle of misery now had examples of resilience to follow. Mornings at the workshop began early, with the smell of fresh coffee mingling with the aroma of dyes drying in the sun. The women arrived gradually, each with her story, each with her wounds, but all united by the same purpose. The sound of the looms created its own melody, a rhythm that pulsed like a collective heart. Maria walked among them, correcting a stitch here, praising a pattern there, always with the patience she had learned from Zelda. The workshop walls were covered with tapestries, each telling a different story. There were pieces depicting the river where it all began, others showing local woodland flowers, some capturing the exact moment the sun bids farewell to the day. Each color was a memory, each thread a silent woven prayer. Visitors who arrived were impressed not only by the beauty of the work, but by the atmosphere of the place. There was an energy there that couldn't be explained, only felt. It was as if the walls held the echo of all the conversations, all the laughter, all the tears that had been shed in that space. Zelda had left her mark in every corner, and her presence remained alive in every detail. None of this would have happened if Maria had followed logic that afternoon by the river, if she had calculated the costs and benefits before acting, if she had listened to the neighbors, child protective services, the voice of prudence that told her to only look out for herself. Life had shown her that the most difficult paths are often those that lead to the most beautiful destinations, that choices made with the heart carry a wisdom that reason doesn't always comprehend. She often thought about this, especially on silent nights when the workshop was empty and she could contemplate everything they had built. She thought about the choices we make without knowing their consequences, about the doors we open when we follow our hearts instead of reason, about the lives that intertwine like threads on a loom, forming patterns that only time reveals. The last tapestry Maria produced following Zelda's direct guidance still hung on the main wall of the workshop. It was a large piece, depicting a young woman carrying an elder in her arms, under a twilight sky. The colors were those only Zelda knew how to create, an orange that seemed to pulsate with life, a deep blue like the approaching night, a gold that captured the last rays of the sun. Visitors frequently asked about this piece. Maria always told the story, from beginning to end without sparing details, and invariably, upon finishing, she saw something in the listener's eyes that she recognized, the same spark she had felt when she decided to rescue a stranger from death, because that's what Zelda had taught her after all. That compassion isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength that exists. That helping others doesn't diminish us, it transforms us, and that sometimes life's greatest treasures are hidden in the most improbable places, waiting for someone to have the courage to find them. Maria looked up at the tapestry, as she did every night before closing the workshop. The evening light streamed through the window, painting everything with orange hues that recalled that first afternoon by the river. She smiled, a smile of gratitude and longing, and whispered to the silence, "Thank you, Zelda, for everything." And somewhere, perhaps in the wind that made the loom's threads vibrate softly, perhaps just in her imagination, Maria heard the reply, "Thank you, child, for making me live again." If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.